I'll welcome you to the last event for the Center for Discursive Inquiry, and organized by Amanda Beach, Christine Wertheim, and myself. I won't read the introduction I had in the interest of time. I'm sure most of you saw it online. I would like to read a quick quote from the new book by Reza Negarestani, Intelligence and Spirit. Geistige intelligence conceives itself through a view from nowhere and no when, as the impersonality of reason, and as a history that is not exhausted by its present. It imagines possible worlds that seem impossible from the perspective of the status quo, from what looks to be the inevitable course of its history. But in their very possibility, these other worlds are as actual as the seemingly actual world of the present. They are just not its world, in that they are causally detached from its world. The task of geistige intelligence, then, is to think of how its world can be connected to these possible worlds, to concretely depart from a present that seems total and inevitable in the direction of worlds that are possible yet far removed. So let me introduce our panelists. Very pleased to present Amanda Beach, an artist and writer. Her work proposes a new realist politics of the artwork and its possibilities in the context of contingency and neo-rationalist conceptions of power. Her recent work has included the comic strip Realism and Its Discontents for Art Margins 2017, the video installation Covenant, Transport, Move or Die, exhibited at the Baltic Center for Contemporary Art 2016-2017, and her paintings Cause and Effect for the Sal Institute of Contemporary Arts, Singapore 2017. Her recent essays include How Art Ought to Think, Art and Reason 2018, and Cold World and Neocon Noir in Cold War, Cold World Urbanomic 2016. And Anna Longo has a PhD in aesthetics from Université Paris 1, where she's been teaching and researching. She is currently working on Deleuze's mathematical differential ontogenesis and Fichte's aesthetics, and is currently editing two books, Retour de l'Objet, Retour de l'Ontologie 2019, Le Paradoxe de l'Infinitude 2019. She has also edited volumes La Genesis du Transcendental 2017, Breaking a Spell, Speculative Realism Under Discussion 2015, Time Without Becoming 2014, and Il Devenir de la Conoscenza 2013, and she's made me speak French and Italian in a very pidgin way, sorry about that. Daniel Zazzalotto, a philosopher and instructor in the CULB Comparative Literature Program. His research focuses on the reconciliation of rationalism with materialism and the pursuit of revisionary naturalism through the work of Wilfrid Sellars, Alain Badiou, Lorenz Pontel, Jay Rosenberg, and Ray Brazier. He's currently preparing a monograph in which he develops a functionalist theory of cognition and realist theory of knowledge, chiefly inspired by the works of Wilfrid Sellars. His essay include Puncturing the Circle of Correlation, 2017, A Thought Disincarnate, What Does It Mean to Think, 2018, Realism and Representation on the Ontological Term, 2012. And last, but certainly not least, Hugo Wilkins took his master's in Sonic Culture at the University of East London and completed his doctorate in Cultural Studies at Goldsmiths in 2016. The title of his thesis was Irreversible Noise, which is a basis for a forthcoming publication by Urbanomic. He is co-director of the online arts journal and research platform Glass Bead. So thank you all, and let's have Daniel take it away, please.
Thank you very much. Can everybody hear me okay? It's all good? Great, thank you. So I'm going to broadcast, I have a PowerPoint that I would like to show. Application window, I suppose. Hold on.
Go into your entire screen.
There we go.
And then switch to over.
That seems. Hopefully it's not. All right, great. I think we're good. Yes. Okay, great. So today I would like to speak about the philosophical concept of possibility and possible world or possible worlds, and its relationship to different fields of philosophical theory on the one hand, so logic, metaphysics, ethics, aesthetics, but also different domains of practice, right? So mathematical thought or domain of practice, scientific domain of thought, political and artistic domains of thought. And in particular, I want to think about the relationship between theory and practice through the philosophical concept of possibility. And to do this, I want to first trace a very brief and protracted genealogy of the concept of possibility and of a possible world. This might be rather pedagogical in a certain way, and for those of you who know, just please bear with me. It's a little cursory, I suppose, but we'll have to do some math. So first, I want to speak about the so-called classical view and the logical concept of possibility. So the first thing to say is that within philosophy, possibility is both a concept within the study of logic in particular, and by extension, really a concept that's intrinsic to metaphysical, epistemological, aesthetic, and ethical investigation. In this original sense, logical sense, the concept of possibility really goes back all the way to Book 1 of Aristotle's Prior Analytics, and to the study of the different forms of the syllogism, which, as everybody knows, is a kind of typology of the different forms of reasoning. And at its most general, the logical study of possibility in this sense is part of what is named in contemporary lingo modality or modal logic, right? Where the relationship specifically is not so much between the possible and the actual, but between the possible and the necessary, in which each term is defined in terms of the other. So possibility is first defined, in fact, as the logical counterpart and in distinction to the concept of necessity. And so this basic definition that's right there shows you how you define the terms interchangeably. So for any proposition P, P is possibly true if and only if it is not necessary that P is not true. And conversely, for any proposition P, P is necessarily true if and only if it is not possible that P is not true, right? Now, the logical relationship between necessity and possibility is obviously very closely connected to the concepts of lawfulness and contingency. This is how we start to see how this logical conception branches into the other parts of philosophical inquiry. So it's part of the way in which we reason about how regularities, dependencies, and inferential relationships that hold across scientific, political, ethical, artistic reasoning in general are to be conceived. So the rules of modality, accordingly, help us to organize our reasoning about things such as causality, for example, as when we think about what ought to be according to the laws of nature, right? A typically problematic concept for the empiricist philosophers in particular. But also what is called deontic modalities, like concepts such as obligation. That's when we speak about what we ought to do according to rules of conduct, like social norms and so on. So the logical investigation of modality immediately constrains ontological, epistemological, aesthetic, and ethical investigation. Just like the general investigation of the forms of the syllogism for Aristotle are not just a formal endeavor, but in a certain sense they constrain how it is that we think more generally about anything we can reason about whatsoever. Now, as the philosophy, as modal logic and logic develops in history, I'm fast forwarding basically all the way to the medieval and scholastic period, the concept of a possible world becomes first really elaborated in answer to specific theological concerns and leading to the formulation of the concept of possible worlds by Leibniz in 1710, as the definition, whose definition is ideas in the mind of God. And this concept was used to reason counterfactually, really, about the possible in relationship to the actual this time, and particularly addressing the problems of evil and freedom. So, I mean, I'm sure, as most of you know, Leibniz argues that since God is perfectly just and omnipotent, we must, by extension, live in the best of all possible worlds. Since if we didn't, then it would follow that God was in some way choosing an imperfect or deficient world, which would contradict his perfect and just nature, right? So that's the first thing to say. Now, I'm going to fast forward to the contemporary conception of possibility and possible worlds. So the first thing to say is that to formalize modal reasoning and modal logic, and following really in the 20th century from the work of C.I. Lewis, philosophers would progressively extend the rather bare resources of first-order predicate logic through the introduction of so-called modal operators, beyond the classical logical connectives and quantifiers that were, of course, the hallmark of the predicate logic of the time. So, as you can see, here we get, once again, the same basic definitions that we had in the classical view, but this time we have a formalization, where we have these nifty symbols, a rhombus and a square. The rhombus is standing for the formal operator for possibility and the square for necessity. Hopefully, this is not old news to everybody here. But taking off from this point, modal logic really introduces operators for different modal concepts and vocabularies. And so we depart from this classical definition and narrow definition of necessity and possibility to really interrogate alethic modal concepts, that's the classical necessity possibility, but also deontic modal concepts such as obligation permission, epistemic modal concepts such as knowledge justification, temporal modal concepts such as always before. And there's this like thing here that doesn't allow you to read that. I don't know how to get rid of it actually, but whatever. The point is that these different modal concepts basically allow us to investigate modal proprieties across different domains of investigation and of practice. Now, following from this formal conception, there is a new concept of what constitutes a possible world, which is really informed by the modal semantic paradigm. And while the concept of possibility, in this sense, appears to be one modal concept among many, belonging again to the classical study of alethic modality, in another sense, it becomes fundamental and, in fact, necessary. So since the 60s and 70s, following from the work specific of Saul Kripke and then developed by Montague, David Lewis, and others, modal conceptual relations are defined in terms of truth in a possible world. So, for example, these are definitions, Kripkean definitions of what constitutes a possible world. So, a statement P is possible if and only if it is true in at least one possible world, and a statement P is necessary if and only if it is true in all possible worlds. But what is a possible world, if not a theological, metaphysical concoction, right? If it's not ideas on the mind of God as it was for the modern Leibnizian conception. And this is where the logical and ontological senses of possibility become not just indissociable, but indiscernible in a certain sense. So, bear with me a little bit here. A possible world, in its most sort of like basic form, is defined as a mathematical structure, which is basically a set, defining set theory, whose elements and inferential relationships are understood through the axioms of axiomatized set theory. Traditionally Sir Mellor-Frankel, but not necessarily. And this needs a little clarification, right? So this is actually what you see in the projector right now, is the definition, the modal semantic definition, as I parse it, of the semantic conception of what constitutes a possible world. So I'll just read it, and hopefully the diagram helps illustrate how this works. So a modal theory is a semantic meta-language which establishes rules of correspondence, C rules, that map the inferential relationships between statements that use modal concepts of a logical language or in a logical language to the inferences holden between the elements of a modal structure. So to the right, you see the possible world. That is the modal structure. That is what is defined in terms of basic set-theoretical relations. And to the left, you have a logical language, which could include any of the modal concepts we've discussed, alethic, deontic, epistemic concepts. And there is a semantic meta-language that helps you establish rules of correspondence between these logical concepts, modal concepts, and the model structures. So there's this correlation between modal concepts and set theoretical mathematical structures, right? So that's the basic sort of idea. Now, this is interesting because the structural conception of what a possible world is entails that the intelligibility of this concept is related to the concept of constructibility. Really. What is possible must be constructible as a model structure in a mathematical sense. And this means that what constitutes a possible world or worlds is not given to us in advance from without or from within. It is neither discovered experientially through some kind of empirical intuition, nor brought into being through some kind of, from an ideal plane of existence, from the mind of God, say, through a kind of intellectual intuition. The construction of the possible is a cognitive and theoretical achievement that's made by us, really. Which is to say, it's a theoretical postulate that allows us to reason about different spaces of possibility, of thinking, and action. Now, this is all very abstract, I understand that, and particularly specialized, it seems, and without obvious correlation to our ordinary concepts of possibility or world, for that matter. And indeed, to understand a possible world in set theoretical terms as a structure immediately is to dive into Platon's terms. Taking mathematical idealities, it would seem, as in some strange sense, real. Someone might say, it is not that possible worlds are sets or mathematical entities, but that set theory in mathematics provides the criterion for intelligibility for what a possible world is. But if possible worlds are not themselves mathematical structures, even if they are expressed by mathematics, what are they? That's the question, right? We seem inclined to ask, how do possible worlds understood as mathematical structures for a modal language relate to real possibilities as they interpret non-mathematical modal domains? And these questions ultimately concern the relationship between our natural languages, wherein our concepts of modality across all of the possible disciplines of philosophy and all the possible domains of discourse are nested, and mathematical languages, and the world, finally. So there's this complicated relationship between conceptual vocabularies, mathematical vocabularies, and the world, which is highly problematic. Now, I'm gonna basically simply try to move forward and try to express, just to wrap up very quickly, about some contemporary approaches that attempt to go beyond this semantic and structural approach to a possible world. And there are two vectors that I would just briefly like to outline here. The former tries to get further apart from natural language to the side of mathematics, and it's what can be broadly called a syntactical approach, which has been called by Luca Fraser, for example, the formalization of dialectics. Canonically, the project of Ludix, which has been popularized by Jean-Yves Girard, among others, because he's the big proponent. And for him, basically, semantics and the semantic conception of possible worlds is a metalinguistic bureaucracy. That's actually his own term, which is really an absence of explanation, right? You just say, okay, you have the modal concepts here, you have the structures there, how they relate, great. You ask for real money and you are paid with meta money. Another great quote of this. And his Ludic program, what it does is very strange. It collapses the distinction between syntax and semantics in favor of a purely syntactical approach, which is really inspired by a procedural logic, which of course I don't have time to explain what it is, and informed by game theoretic and proof theoretic axiomatics. The other approach, the other vector, is to try to move a little bit further apart from the mathematization and semantic paradigm, and this is what is called the dialectics of formalization. So there are two examples that I just cite here briefly. One is, for example, the project initiated by Fernando Salamea, who uses broadly a Peircean meta-conceptual framework to understand processes of cultural production in the arts and literature and all domains of human practice, in analogy with the formal operations of synthesis and relation, which define the mathematical universe in its breadth, not only set theory and first-order logics, but more robustly any kind of mathematical vocabulary, including specifically category theory being a particularly central one. Badiou, Alain Badiou, who I presume a lot of you might be familiar with, embraces the role, the primitive role that set theory plays in our explanatory paradigms. He says set theory is ontology, and Zermelo Frankel axiomatization of ontology at that. But he says that actually set theoretical determinations are indifferent to modal determinations. They have nothing to do with possibility or actuality. And in turn, what he does is produce this meta-ontology, this conceptual philosophical dialectic, which correlates the axioms of set theory to procedures transpiring in politics, the arts, science, and love, what he calls the conditions of philosophy or truth procedures. So basically, what you have both in Salomé and Badiou is an interesting sort of process of analogical transposition, where mathematical structures, axioms, and languages are, in this kind of like facile and very general sense, transposed into all kinds of descriptions concerning our worlds. So finally, just to wrap up, this second line of explanation of Salomé also feels very abstract, but in an opposite way, right? Because if the semantic conception seems very narrow and almost myopic in scope, the analogical structure proposed by Badiou and Salomé appears a little bit too general, rehearsing familiar tropes about revolution, invention, synthesis, decision, event, you name it. And I think it is in this choice between analytic myopia and analogical banality that a war between analytic and continental philosophy continues to historically play itself out today. And the stakes are as follows. This is really, I think, like the kind of just a takeaway from meditation. I have no solutions, not here. What would be a plausible resolution between the analytic and systematic approaches which take the best from both while avoiding its pitfalls, or their pitfalls, right? How is it possible to think of a concept of possibility in its theoretical and practical dimensions in a rigorous way, neither constraining construction to the myopia of the semantic logical conception, by neither simply helping ourselves to analogies to capriciously draw correlations of a historical scope, like Badiou and Salomé do, to aspire, that is, at once to maximal analytic precision and maximal systematic comprehensiveness. And this is where I think, this is the last thing I will say, this is just the last slide here, but this is where I believe that contemporary philosophy, as it were, is straddling the lines between analytic and continental approaches with the work of many contemporary philosophers really trying to aspire for a maximal degree of, let's call it formal rigor, without at the same time just simply losing the systematic scope of philosophy. And even though I do think that people like Salomé and Badiou do, as it were, show us the way and begin this process, it's still a very rudimentary stage in this process of weaving our systematics and our formal approaches. Maybe just to close up, I would just point to you two works that I believe encapsulate the most sophisticated and developed forms of such resolution. One is Lawrence Puntel's Structure and Being. It's a book that was already written, I believe, in 1990-something, maybe. But it's a phenomenal book, very rigorous and very comprehensive as well. And the other one is the 3-volume work by Uwe Peterson, which is about diagonal dialectical logic. I don't have time to really get into this in depth right now, but hopefully we can talk about this later. Thank you.
Thank you.
And let me just. Oh, wow. Can you remember this?
Yeah, looks like we have some new
Okay.
people on here now.
So, you're good, Sean? Okay, good. All right, okay. All right, Anna Longo, please.
Hi. So, yes, my talk is really different from the previous one. And I will introduce sort of not well-known kind of judgment, which is the thetic judgment, which will allow us to think of possible worlds. Okay, so we know that there are synthetic and analytic judgments. So analytic judgments unfold what is implicit in a principle or a concept. And the synthetic judgment unifies different elements within the unity of a concept. That's a pretty easy definition. So we could say that knowledge as a representation of a given reality needs both this judgment, synthetic and analytic. So thinking is a matter of producing a synthesis according to a certain set of rules that can be established analytically, starting from a first principle or an established axioms. So in some rules for producing synthesis. However, what is produced in this way is a representation which depends on the fact that a reality is given. So the activity of a knowing subject is determined by this relation to a real. They cannot make a synthesis without something which is given. Accordingly, following Fichte, and following here this German idealist philosopher, we can say that the knowing subject is not actually free, since her activity depends on the fact that something is given. So as a consequence, knowledge cannot be considered apolitically true, since it is the result of a synthesis which is produced by concepts which are heterogeneous with respect to the given matter. So it is a mere fact rather than a necessity, but our description of a phenomenon real is based on some concept instead of others, which would be equally possible. So it is evident that such a subject, whose activity of synthesis is constrained by a passively received reality, cannot be considered as the subject required by artistic creation and morality. The condition for creation, as well as the condition for morality, is freedom, here intended as autonomy. Accordingly, we could say that the purpose of speculative philosophy is to access the perspective from which the given can be seen as produced in agreement with the requirements of freedom. That means that the given should be seen as autonomously constructed. So it is only in this way that one could be allowed to state that the world which is compatible with the needs of freedom is possible. In fact, in the same way as the artist can be considered as a creator only if he imitates natural productivity rather than imitating natural products, the moral subject is free only if her actions can bring about some real effect. That is, if his action can participate to the construction of the world according to specific ends. So this perspective that Fichte's philosophy aims to achieve is the transcendental viewpoint from which the structure of the real and the conceptual structure of thought can be intuited as reciprocally determined realities which are both posited by an original free act. So in this way, the constraints of the real would be the same constraint that the autonomous subject chooses for itself. However, this free act of self-positing cannot be accessed or known, neither by synthetic nor by analytical judgments, since the former apply to an already given reality, and the latter to an already given concept. Thus, the problem is this. On which ground can we claim that the world suitable for the realization of freedom is possible? In the science of knowledge, Fichte says that the philosophical access to the free act of positing is provided by a special kind of judgment, which is neither synthetic nor analytic. is the judgment that he called aesthetic judgment. He provides 3 examples of aesthetic judgments. The first is I am. By saying I am, nothing is predicated of the subject, but its reality is posited by a sort of performative act of self-institution. The second example of aesthetic judgment is man is free. So if we consider the judgment man is free as an analytical judgment, it's clearly false, since the concept of man implies his finitude and his dependency from a given reality. So man is not free analytically. Moreover, man is free is false as a synthetic judgment as well, since there is no ground to include man as a natural being in the class of free beings, since no natural being is free, as nature is a set of the effects of natural laws. According to Fichte, then, man is free is true only as a speculative aesthetic judgment. And this means, I quote, man must approach ad infinitum to a freedom that he can never, in principle, attain. End of quote. Aesthetic judgment is not concerned with knowledge or representation of a given reality, but with the identity of the act of positing and what is posited. It concerns the ground that allows of the construction of a possible world, and thus for the different possible modalities of reciprocally determined subject and object. Aesthetic judgment postulates the identity of the idea as a differential limit and what is produced according to the idea. Thus, it always has a negative form. In the case of our example, that man is free, means that man must be supposed to be the product of an act of self-determination, which is a free and contingent act. Nevertheless, the fact of being such a product of self-determination entails that he is a determined being who is non-identical with the absolutely free subject of the act of positing. Then, rather than man is free or man is not free, the aesthetic judgment must be expressed as man is non-free. This means that freedom is at the same time the condition of existence of a man as a limited being and the positive limit toward which he must orient his activity in order to make his limited activity equal to the activity of self-positing. Thus, rather than a predication that can be said of a subject or an inner essential property, freedom is the end of an infinite strive toward the production of a possible world which corresponds to the demand of reason. So it's the striving toward the limiting idea of the identity of the positing and the posited. Of course, many approximations to freedom are possible as worlds or conceptually constructed phenomenal realities. Before concluding, I would like to mention the third example of aesthetic judgment that Fichte provides. It is the aesthetic judgment. As we read in The Science of Knowledge, I quote, the judgment of taste, A is beautiful, so far as A contains a future also present in the ideal of beauty, is likewise aesthetic judgment. For I cannot compare this feature with the ideal, since the latter is unknown to me. It is rather a mental task derived from the absolute positing of myself to discover this ideal, though one that could only be discharged after a complete approximation to the infinite. End of quote. An explanation for this claim can be found in the Practical Philosophy. Here, Fichte explains that the artist's activity consists in letting imagination to work as if it were free, as if it could produce forms and objects independently from the needs of representation. The aesthetic pleasure is seen as linked to the feeling of the striving performed by imagination in order to be free. So in art production, imagination will then strive to produce images or forms of a possible reality which does not depend on the given one and that can be perceived as approaching the ideal of beauty. This ideal corresponds to the products of an absolutely free and autonomous imagination. So it's not beauty like a form, it's beauty like the ideal freedom in production. So I quote, "As far as this drive is concerned, the representation is its own end. It does not derive its value from harmonizing with the object, which pays no heed, but possesses it within itself. What is sought is not a copy of anything, but the free and independent form of the image itself. Without any reciprocal determination between it and the object, such a representation stands there isolated, as the final goal of the aesthetic drive, and is not directed at anything to which it is supposed to conform, or which is supposed to conform to it." End of quote. However, imagination is not actually free. It can only strive for freedom and strive to attain the ideal of beauty. For this reason, since artistic production makes us feeling the strive for freedom, Fichte considers aesthetic as an essential first step toward the establishment of a science of knowledge, which grounds the possibility of morality, since it allows to reach the transcendental standpoint from which reality appears not to be given but produced. So as we read in the science of knowledge, I quote, "From the ordinary point of view, the world appears to be something given. From the transcendental point of view, it appears to be something produced. From the aesthetic point of view, the world appears to be given to us just as if we had produced it, and to be just the sort of world we would have been produced. To the aesthetic sense, the world appears to be free. To the ordinary sense, it appears to be a product of compulsion." End of quote. As aesthetic judgment, the aesthetic judgment is not meant to know artistic works as products of freedom, but to orient the activity of imagination toward the production of works which approximate the unachievable limit of freedom. Any possible word is at the same time the product of the striving for freedom and a negation of actual and ideal freedom. Thanks.
Okay, very good, thank you. And please.
Okay, thanks. Thanks, Sean. Again, I'll say what Anna said, which is my paper's different to both, but I am interested in real possibilities and social conditions. Okay, so maybe there's something there. And I'm going to start off with a fairly mundane example to just set off on these set of questions that I have. And I'm going to read for the sake of time. So after David Bowie died in January 2016, as most of us know, the airwaves were full of recordings, songs and interviews from throughout his career. And this is a true story, which I don't normally do. But driving in my car, I heard a snippet of an interview. I was pulling into a gas station, and it was from around the Ziggy era, sometime before he would record the farewell gig with the Spiders at the Hammersmith Odeon in July '73. So Bowie was being asked about his motivations to produce a character from a fictive world, and the world that this character would eventually create. Ziggy was the alien other that would forecast a different approach to identity and the possibilities for culture's role in producing a communal future, a future for the alienated. Bowie's response was memorable. He spoke about two options pop music presented to him at that time. First was to rework existing genres, hits, knowable rhythm, beats and stock anthems, a kind of post-structuralist remixing of the known. And the second option was to make music that admitted that pop music was producing its own death in an endless cycle of repetition. Irony. Both options were impossible if he wanted to continue to make music that was different. So it's quite amazing that he was saying this at that time. I thought that's pretty cool. So I remembered it, and for him, the way forward, the only option it seemed was to produce another space, another form and position via a fiction. And this fiction was not just a figure of the alien as character, but the very idea of an imaginative conceptual methodology that thinks from a different place, outside of the given methods and approaches of music production at that time. So this method of conceptualizing a larger possible reality was not included in the current world of pop music. Like I was saying at that time, but it would still make use of particularities of music, of the history of music and other genres. So, such as Japanese dress, other forms of culture that he would kind of bring together as part of that identity. Science fiction and the glam rock genre of music, so on. So therefore, despite the call upon the figure of extraterrestrial encounters as an alien identity, we have something different, a kind of alien expression in Bowie's description, not of Ziggy itself, but in the expression of the mechanism of Ziggy's genesis. So that's significant to me here. So the form of like a figure of an alien or the cliche of an alien never replaces the concept of thinking differently. And instead they're kind of put in symmetry. In doing so, this approach to fiction and reality maintains the ideal that other worlds beyond the remix and beyond the self-conscious expressions of the end of pop could be thought and implemented. So Ziggy Stardust as a phenomena produces the belief that as a totality, it has no direct referential association to one particular genre of music or to the world of music itself, but maintains its self-definition as music. So I was thinking about this because it allows me to grasp at a very basic level the question of what we expect from culture when it comes to the production of the future. So we might share those dissatisfactions that Bowie expressed now, even 50 years later, when the world we live in seems to conjure an Adornian nightmare where apathy and agency collide to exclude real possibilities in a flood of choices that make the act of decision banal. And I'm not sure if Bowie's mechanism of production would support art today, especially when, as he knew so well, the concept of the alien gets reconditioned and attached so quickly to not only the idea of a symbolic and particular alien identity, such as Ziggy Stardust or the man who fell to Earth, but that this is connected to an identity of change and difference in itself, in a multiplicity of identities, from Ziggy to Aladdin Sane, from the hippie to the thin white Jew, an effervescent production that framed and played Bowie's career. But it is this outside that persists and undergirds the imagination itself. So to work beyond the scope of banality, we must think carefully about the imperative that has subtended art and politics alike. That is the possibility to think the impossible and to take this seriously. This principle of difference acts as an injunction to manifest something that's not yet existed, but what directionality or line does a semantic expression of a principle of difference in the world project? If we ask this question to art, then we are led to comprehend the complexity of abstract ideas that cross all forms of expression and their interplay as and with abstract forms. These extend from us and compel us to invoke new rules, systems, and worlds, but they lead us to ask if the principle of difference is political or if it has content enough for any reach to that which seems to be impossible or unachievable at a material level of constraints. So what I mean by this is for us to focus on constructing the possible beyond the excoriating conditions of neoliberal capital. We must examine a more metaphysical question regarding the qualitative content, tenability, and cause of the principle of difference specifically. To address this question of direction, principles, and capitalism itself as one of the many aleatory forces we talk about, we must immediately overcome the post-structuralist error that tells us how history is a set of flexible fictions that is ultimately indeterminate and groundless. we must also eliminate the general promotion of the liberalist idea that the present could always have been otherwise. It's fascinating to see how this myth of the otherwise maintains itself despite the contradictory fact that we're living in the present as it is. We live in the world as none otherwise. An alternative hypothetical reality imagined in the present may be titillating, but ultimately it is naive. It paints the human into the corner of a tragic voluntaristic freedom. We are beset by historical time, read as he autonomous nature. The idea of a freedom that is built upon the possibility that everything could have been different, the past and present theory of possible worlds, is purchased in the debt of ignoring and avoiding a real and experimental inquiry into the systems that subtend reality as it is, and furthermore, they deny the thinking of what life ought to be in the future. This notion of taking history and cause seriously is not to say that we are prevented from making decisions in the present, or that history is fate. My argument here is that the notion of what could be otherwise is the enemy of what is constructively possible for a world, since it incorrectly denies that decisions we make in the world include and rely upon history as a set of given constraints that the world we live in is a world we caused. Art has posed as the conjuncture or happening between worlds that have perennially been cast in a similar light, a world of chaotic time of nature and a world of words. And we see this most particularly with the formal manifestation of artworks that are actually called events, happenings, and such like in the mid-60s that took time as their primary form. This occupation of the landscape of the temporal assumed it could bypass and outrun the conditions of construction and representation that worlds seem to require. Art would traverse the imagination and the constraints of the world as given in the act of rendering itself open to the possible. In this case, the idea of claiming oneself to be the catalyst for the possible in general would overcome the problems of working within the world of cause, and therefore art would see itself as dodging the bullet of being functionalist, instrumental, and utilitarian, all of which would be labelled as politically suspicious and associated with dominant and organised power. Without ontology or telos, this was an art of the real, art as nomadic, nature in process, and art without figure. And the real, in this case, thrives upon art's use of non-linguistic expressions. It was primarily defined as a space of the senses, untranslatable but felt. So we can see that a key problem here is that art persists in associating non-linguistic sense-based experiences to the real and conceptualization to representational knowns, or in other words, the normative space of ordinary language. It cannot reconcile the fact that non-linguistic experience operate as part of representational dynamics, because the concept of what art is and what art can do relies upon a theory of art as a mirror of reality, as radical instability, worldlessness, and plurality. This diagnosis of the formal divisions within the variants of language are incorrect. Just want to underscore that. So I'm describing something that I completely disagree with, just to be clear. In apparent opposition to this, we can examine the work of a rationalist art that would seek to understand and explicate the paradox that I've just described. This is anti-realist in nature. In this, we are asked to take the real seriously so much that we must understand that crafting objective accounts of the real is futile, and there is no such thing as a mind-independent reality. But saying that an image is always inadequate to the real is tantamount to inducting it into the world of pixies, fairies, and Santa Claus, a destiny of kitsch. It leaves us only able to speak to the constructive nature of all constructions. In this sense, as a critical category and approach to artistic production, this results in works that show their working, reveal their constructive nature, reveal their unreality. The theory cannot reorientate or reframe our world, nor invent or determine other worlds, due to an overdetermination of the disunity between the real and the representational on the one hand, and on the other hand, a reliance upon that conflation, where the artwork as explication situates an implicit impossibility of the real in image form, and then goes ahead and does it anyway by making true the effigy of the real as narrative presence before us. So the artwork is everything the real isn't. The question of what is possible then asks us to take the possibility of what is not present to us, what is thinkable, seriously. This invites us to work through the conditions of epistemic and deontic modalities. That is, to analyse the structure of the relations between what is possible and necessary in the field of our knowledge, and how our sense of obligation, commitments, and oughts might condition by means of rules of behaviour for what is possible. In terms of art, we are compelled to pose the question across these modalities of both the material conditions of art and the concept of art itself, to discuss art's deontic modalities and to ask how they should be understood in relation to the epistemic. So just briefly, I just want to say that in the text Modality and Normativity, Robert Brandom seeks to illuminate and explicate the relation between modal and normative languages, two non-referential models of expression. Modal vocabularies of the metalinguistic kind that extend from logic but surpass the bounds of empiricism and logical explanation, and normative vocabularies that are rooted in intentional dispositions and beliefs. So modal vocabularies that form extensions into the thought of possible worlds generate problems due to either their spatio-temporal dislocation from the empirical world or their general presentation of irreducibility to forms of logical explanation. He says, the epistemological question of how we are to understand the possibility of our knowing anything about such items and their accessibility relations, and the question how, if the possibility of such cognitive contact is mysterious, the idea of our having the semantic contact necessary so much to talk or think about them can be made intelligible are wholly untouched by the formal apparatus. That's the end of the quote. So these problems that he's describing retrieve a standard issue with the political social value of inferential commitments. And it reminds us of the myths of artistic practices, wherein the irreducibility to the systematization or grounding of both modal vocabularies and art risks situating them as trivial forms of fictional expression and at the same time as special identities of the real. Brandon draws the conclusion that, quote, to understand the relation between how things merely are and how they must be, or a different matter ought to be, one must look at what one is doing in saying how things are and what is required to say what one is thereby doing, end quote. So meta-discursive practice here is the key to understanding the relation between reality and the future. Brandon asks us to understand how we describe the beliefs, behaviours and methods that articulate how we approach reality and produce descriptions of it, with an analysis of what is necessary to communicate these descriptions. Now, this is quite sensible, it would seem, but it introduces the question as to how the meta-discursive takes place in the world, and if this can take place within the field of art without its analytics ultimately opposing the possibilities for a commitment to a future. So what form would explication take, and would we recognise the world it shows us? So I think we need to spend some time and effort to consider the real possibilities for a conceptual or a rational art by means of a different methodological approach to knowledge and representation, to comprehend in thought and practice how our conceptualizations and representations divide, order, and give reasons for the world, as well as to ask for reasons for it. It would seem that for art to begin to engage with the possible, it must first reorientate its very conception of the terms and rules that organise these modal vocabularies. So that's it, thanks.
Thank you, Amanda. You are welcome, Mr. Reed.
Thanks. Okay, so should I say my paper's the same? Oh, it's different. Okay, yeah. So yeah, I want to start by talking about, okay, so if we're talking about language and possible worlds, firstly, I think we have to say, you know, what is language? And that's a demarcation problem, I think, from, you know, between language and animal communication systems. And so I think we can give a good story about that. So I think, you know, this argument by Gary Tomlinson is very good, that there's a kind of a co-evolution of proto-language and proto-music, that occurs during a period from about 1 million years ago to 40,000 years ago in the hominin line. And so that's, you know, telling a story from how we came from this kind of, the roots of our thinking in indexical gesticles of animals, so which are kind of communicating meaning via tone, but the contours of communications, to this kind of systematized capacity that we have now. And so the argument is that it's over this long period that you get this increasing complexity of proto-language with an increasing capacity for precise reference to objects or ideas that may not be indexically co-present to the interaction. But also in the social role of proto-music in the collective organization of belief or the reduction of uncertainties. So the idea is here that the proto-music is different from the musicality of animal calls because it functions through the use of sound as a kind of qualitative material that constructs or maintains a form of social organization. So basically, then, through this process, proto-language and proto-music both come to refer to that which is not, effectively, but in two very different ways. So you get, on the one hand, this kind of increasingly precise, intentional reference that is developed in proto-language, and then on the other hand, you get this increasingly free, as it were, like what we can call a floating intentionality, or a kind of, we can say that there's a determinate signification on the side of language and an indeterminate signification on the side of music. And both of these enable this kind of release from proximity, from the kind of co-present interaction. So with this, we have not just the present sense of uncertainty that is characteristic of an animal's vigilance to predation, but also imagination and uncertainty concerning what is not present. And most importantly, we have the capacity to use that which is not in order to change the present conditions of uncertainty. So yeah, then I guess what you've got is the construction of a social technology for the organization of behavioral and metaphysical possibilities. That's like that is at the roots of our kind of normative organization of thought, right? Social organization of thought, and that's like both in language and in music and also visual science, right? And I think Bloch has this nice. Maurice Bloch has this nice distinction. He distinguishes between transactional and transcendental sociality. So, like other primates, for example, have their social roles are constructed by the co-present transactions that they have in their encounters. Whereas the role of a shaman or a hunt leader is a transcendental role in the sense that it's organized outside of those interactions. So I guess then, like, the question at the root of this is like, how did the acquisition of proto-conceptual indexical signs lead to the development of the concept proper and its logical inferential framework? I think then we can the way that we can describe this is a kind of pragmatic elaboration from indexical systematicity to the formal operations of a symbolic system, or symbolic systems. And I think two artifacts which point to this change, to this shift in cognitive architecture. Right? One of these is the Swabian pipes, which is the first kind of musical instrument that we discovered 40,000 years ago. So it's a kind of flute with holes pierced in it, which which are organizing the tonal capacities of that instrument, right? So, and that kind of shows you that we've got this cognitive capacity for abstraction, generalization, systematicity, hierarchical and combinatorial organization of cognitions, and also the measurement and control of qualitative phenomena. And secondly, another artifact that people often point to is the Lion Man, which is this kind of half man, half lion statue, which we can say it's like, it's kind of proof that there's this kind of imaginative transformation of our empirical experience into something, something which is not, right? So some chimera, which is the pure product of our imagination, right? And so effectively the argument here is that kind of what we've developed is a sophisticated capacity for causal reasoning using counterfactuals. Then so this was 40,000 years ago. Many millennia of causal reasoning followed, and you have like within that the theoretical and practical elaboration of language, logic, maths, and various aspects of culture, including modal logic, which Dan talked about. But and it's not really until 400 years ago that we get the mathematical formalization of probability theory, which allows for objective calculation of uncertainties. And I think that is what's kind of at the root of what I think our kind of modern understanding of possible is, right? And this is occurring more or less at the same time as what Dan was talking about, Leibniz's kind of theological conception of possible worlds, more or less around the same time as probability theory was being developed. And this was also kind of at the inception of capitalism and the development of statistics and so forth, right? So to me, when I think of the language of possible worlds, it's the language that insurance speaks. It's the framework of statistics, which is based on this kind of really paradoxically based on the kind of abandonment of causal reasoning. Causality is seen as metaphysics, and you get rather this treatment of pure mathematical facts of the matter, and the kind of ongoing inductive assessment of the strengths of associations between variables. So a causal relation is redefined as kind of an association with a strong possibility, with a strong probability, or probability 1. It's also it's also the language of speculative finance and derivatives markets. It's the language of AI, so ethical choices for self-driving cars and so on. But what current AI doesn't understand, what statistics can't do as well, is to understand the difference between observing an event and making it happen, making an event happen, making it true. So between statistical correlations and causal relations. So I think we have to distinguish this formal calculation of possibility that we get in this whole statistical paradigm and AI from two things, right? One, the unconscious processes of probabilistic reasoning or uncertainty reduction that occurs cognitively. And I think we can understand that according to this idea of a generative model that is both counterfactually elaborated and counterfactually robust. Right? And secondly, we have to distinguish that from the revisionary constructive capacity of logico-conceptual normative linguistic thought, right? The capacity of thinking to change its own conditions. But we should also recognize that counterfactuality kind of So yeah, well, let me start from this first. The first kind of thing I was distinguishing, right, is this unconscious processes, right? And so, so with Metzinger, Metzinger, a neurophilosopher, argues that all phenomenal experience is counterfactual, right? And it's the reason we can say this is because we experience the present has a certain texture, a certain kind of temporal kind of texture, right? So it's we don't experience a series of instants. We experience a now which has a certain kind of length, right? And so that's a synthetic neurocomputational construct. Something like we could say a transcendental condition of thought, perhaps. Underlain by what Husserl called retentions and pretensions. Or we can update this in contemporary language by saying, so predictive processing understands cognitive systems of predictively tracking the causal structure of the external world through the continuous calibration of a generative model of its dynamics within a hierarchically nested architecture of Bayesian priors and hyperpriors. So expectations about what we expect, what we expect those causal trajectories to unfold. So what we experience at any moment of time is the current best top-down hypothesis for explaining the ongoing bottom-up stream of sensory input. So experience is a past-present projection of the present woven into a synthetic dynamic generative model of the future trajectories of the relevant causal structures being tracked. Right?
Can you repeat that?
That last bit? Okay. So what we experience at any moment in time is the current best top-down hypothesis for explaining away the ongoing bottom-up stream of sensory input. So it's a past-present projection of the present woven into a synthetic dynamic generative model of the future trajectories of the relevant causal structures being tracked.
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
And and this was already kind of there in some ways with phenomenology recognized this, right? So and Helmholtz, who was kind of basically operationalizing the Kantian philosophy, much in agreement with Husserl's later phenomenology, in the sense that the phenomenal object is seen as constituted through a global synthetic operation, right? So gluing together the local sections of the phenomena, right, which are not given in an instant, right? And that includes kind of imaginative variations, right? Imagining the other side of the object, and kinesthetic variations as well, right? So altering your perspective in order to constitute the phenomenon, right? We should also say at this point, against the myth of the given, that Sellers pointed out, we should acknowledge that all sapient perception, so the phenomenological experience that we have, is suffused with conception. So we don't just have this given capacity for kind of counterfactually organizing our world. That's conceptually enabled, right? And moreover, we constitute the phenomenon by overcoming our locally constrained perspective, right? So we vary our empirical perspective, but according to Kant, we're still stuck in a transcendental perspective, right? So, we vary around here, but we're stuck here in transcendental space. But I think, I think we can argue here with, and I guess that this comes together with, for example, Anna said imagination is not free, and Amanda talked about Bowie's dilemma in terms of producing the new, right? How do you think the new? How do you think outside of your possibility space if you're stuck in this transcendental perspective, right? But I think I agree with Katrin that the transcendental position is not a fixed a priori, but it's open to variations itself, right? So we can, just as we can take a walk in empirical space, we can take a walk in transcendental space or K space, right? And I think, importantly, I'm a Salesian in some ways, but I think, the elaboration of possible worlds does not take place solely within the space of reasons, and at least in as much as the space of reasons is considered as a purely linguistic space, right? So otherwise we have some kind of political quietism of the Habermasian or Brandonian sort, right? And as Dan said, we don't discover possible worlds through empirical investigation solely either, right? It's a cognitive achievement, and most clearly, it can be thought of. Most clearly, example could be like a technological development, such as like the invention of the phonograph or the concept of zero, for example, right? But also, I think this kind of transformation or this walking in K-space is possible through through artistic forms of reasoning. So I think, there's, I think there are some, we have this kind of history of, and I think, Amanda was talking about this, this history of arts kind of grappling with its condition in terms of like its history of what it can do socially, and what it has been taken to be doing socially as well, right? So I think in some ways we can now talk about a kind of post-conceptual or transmodern art, which is no longer either representational or anti-representational, so neither purely aesthetic nor radically anti-aesthetic, but a kind of transmodern art that traverses possible worlds. And I think just to throw a few examples out there, like Florian Hecker's Script for Machine Synthesis, Ursula Le Guin and Todd Barton's Music and Poetry of the Kesh, Incheng's Emissaries, or Klein's Tommy. All of these are kind of artworks that I think are kind of, conceptually exploring those possibilities, of exploring possible worlds, both at the conceptual and the non-conceptual, or discursive and non-discursive levels. So this is one of the ways that we can imagine possible worlds.
Well, I think questions, please. Yes, Martin.
I have a question. My head's still buzzing, so if I can work through this. I think I have two questions, actually. First one, it has something to do with politics. Fichte was the person who got me thinking about it, or Anna, who was talking about Fichte, and of course there's French revolutionary values there in the background. We're talking about freedom in your presentation. So I think very often we tend to associate the pursuit of possible worlds with freedom. Amanda partly addressed this in her presentation as well. But I'm trying to think what it might mean to try to rethink the pursuit of possible worlds with the pursuit of unfreedom. One very sort of concrete pop cultural example that's in the back of my mind here is Netflix just released, the third season of Men in the High Castle, based on Philip K. Dick's book, which has to do with fascists really being invested in the pursuit of power in various parallel worlds, what they call the Maiden Belt. So that's a pursuit of possible worlds, but specifically with non-French revolutionary values as part of the project of fascism. So what might that mean in the context of thinking about possible worlds, that association with unfreedom as opposed to freedom? I know you tried to negotiate that a little bit by talking about non-free and free, and so breaking down these kind of binaries. I think it could be an interesting question to considered. I wonder what thoughts you have on that. And then sort of related, this was the David Bowie example that got me thinking about that. You know, if Bowie was, you know, opening up this sort of third option, you know, he was sort of talking about the constraints of pop and then what might we do that would be different and it might be coming from the future and then we'd have new pop. I was thinking a little bit about the other research group we have also, Variety of Futurisms. I was thinking about Afrofuturism, for example, in this context, and people like Sandra, or you know, folks who are invested in the future and sci-fi in the musical context, not because necessarily they want to come up with new music, but because there was a bigger history behind that of oppressed people and slavery and emancipating the people, and that goes back partly to the question of freedom and emancipatory values and so on and so forth. So. You know, Bowie is sort of one side of it. You tied neoliberalism and capitalism into that, but I'm wondering what about Afrofuturism and maybe, you know, bigger concerns in this context that really would have to do with questions of slavery, for example, and investigation of possible roles in that context. So raising the stakes a little bit from a slightly other dimension in the context of that conversation. So I'm wondering if people have thoughts on this.
Okay, so to answer to the question of freedom and the pursuit of non-freedom, I think that it doesn't make any difference in the sense that in order to choose to pursue non-freedom instead of freedom means that you need to be free in order to choose. So if you want to be not free, you have to be free in order to choose, but you don't want to be free. So in order to choose non-freedom, you have to be free before choosing.
So the fascists are free when they're pursuing to pursue.
Yeah, but then.
Freedom.
Yeah, but then according to the Celtic judgment, so that it's always us striving for freedom. So it's always us striving to be able to a pure act of self-determination. So I determine myself as a non-free person or as a free person. This act is something which is inachievable. So it's the goal of a strive.
Mm-hmm.
So I can say, okay, I want to be the perfect fascist, and this is my act of freedom. But you have to achieve not only this in a perfect way, but also the world in which perfect fascism is possible. And it's a strive toward realization of, I mean, the word, it's the condition for the possibility of the actualization of a world is freedom. But any realization or any actualization is a negation of freedom in itself, because you are constrained your world. It's a world of constraint which is produced by a free act. So then you can choose what kind of constraint you want. So if you want a constraint which is a fascist one, for example, or if you want a constraint which is the world in which reason can express itself. But in any case, any actualization is a negation of a free act in itself.
I understand it. So are you saying that Fichte is not enabling us in this context to actually make a call on fascism is bad, freedom in another sense is good? I mean, is it purely at the abstract level of we are free to decide to be perfect fascist and,
no.
It's totally fine to
no, the goal is to achieve the world in which is reasonable. The world of, it's supporting a Kantian perspective. So according to a Kantian perspective, morality can be expressed in a particular kind of world and not in another one. The idea is to produce the world in which morality is possible, the world which is compatible with my moral needs. So that would be the goal. So the production of a world which is compatible with the needs of reason. Of course, one can produce also a world which is not compatible with the needs of reason. But the very fact of being So if it was possible to produce the world, the condition with creation of a world which is a world compatible with reason and not is in any case freedom. But in any case, it's a negation of freedom. So there are different degrees in a certain way. So it's a way of the ideal is a limit which is inachievable, and there are different approximations to this limit.
I understand what you're explaining. I think I'm asking for what grounds might we have in this context to actually make a political assessment, bad possible world, good possible world. So it's a very basic, more concrete question. I think you're arguing in a more abstract.
Yes, of course.
Yeah, I understand. Sorry, I want to take that.
Maybe I'll just say something very quick about the Bowie thing. I think the Bowie thing was I just wanted to say something about it because for me, it's indicative of a very standard dilemma for a lot of artists, right? Or, you know, I mean artists in the big sense, like whether you're making music or whatever. But it seems that like what was attractive about it was actually the fact that I'm trying to argue a little bit, I think, that it's not the third way. I mean, I'm a bit tired of like, and I have been for a long time, like, oh, there's this option, and if only we could like go the third way, and then like we can resolve the problem across these two aspects, and then there's a kind of solution. So I'm not interested in like a formal solution, and I think that's a kind of problem to this. But what was interesting about it for me was to think about the mechanism of thinking, the autonomy itself, like that must be done, that the autonomy that must be thought in order to imagine another possibility or another culture or another type of production. So the thing that confuses that, of course, is the identarian, like the actual picture of an alien, you know, the claim to alien likeness, like, you know, however much I like the Man Who Fell to Earth, you know, it's still a picture of an alien in a kind of really pretty cliche way. So at the level of identity, it doesn't really wash. But at the level of mechanism, I think it stands as a very interesting method to insist on a kind of autonomy in the conditions of production that nevertheless emerges from the given and takes place within the world. So it's not a kind of fantasy of I'm not living in the world. So it's not that hypothetical anti-realist thing of like, the real is inaccessible, so I'm exposing its construction, but neither is it, I am the real, I am the manifestation of it either. It was interesting to me because it produced this kind of mechanistic approach to the production of form. And, you know, I think that, yeah, it's, as I said in the paper, it's got total limits when it comes to the conditions of like neoliberal identity obsessions. And I think that, I guess, when it comes to like the question of freedom and what it can posit possibly for the political is something that I wanted to kind of, I guess I wanted to say, and I tried to say this in the paper, is that the very principle or the obligation to difference that motivates even the idea of producing the music. So the idea that you're a musician and you're going, something tells me that I need to make new music and not that shit or that shit. So the very motivation to the new and the principle of difference that might commit us or obligate us to do that is interesting to me in the sense of, well, it's a standard question, but how do we do that beyond the conditions of the principle of difference of neoliberal capital? So the answer to that for me is, well, we need to endow and think about that the kind of cause of the principle or the genesis of the principle of difference and give that qualitative content like a robust notion of difference rather than the kind of habituation of it or naturalization of it. And I think that then might allow us to overcome the problem of the identitarian that often gets washed away with the political in the consequences of these identities that are produced. That's kind of what I'm trying to look for.
Thank you.
Okay.
Go for it.
I've been thinking about our last meeting so much, with Amanda and everything that you guys are talking today. I'm just wondering, if you're from up here, how do you break down and deconstruct all these things that you guys are saying to build a new world instead of building that third option in the middle? I hope that.
What's the third option?
When I
What a minute.
when I was going like, stop making music. And then that. Cool.
Well, maybe you can ask by cross asking something about that distinction to you. Is that?
Okay, but then I want to hear about the walk and the transcendental.
Okay,
Okay.
no, but to this
Yes,
question
I mean,
first.
like,
I mean, so there's this question, so the original, the sort of disjunction that Bowie presents, right? The first one being this kind of post-structuralist reworking of the genre.
Yeah.
The second one being just repetition until it kills itself.
yeah,
I found that immediately interesting because it almost draws an analogy with, it can almost be mapped diametrically to a conception of reinvention in this kind of romantic, facile sense, not constrained by structure, we change, we invent new.
Yeah.
And the second one seems to be right-wing, if you will, in the sense that it understands pop in analogy with capital.
Mhm.
The self-reproductive movement, which just escalates and reproduces and repeats itself until it crashes into the ground, which is a sort of like, and so the idea is that, okay, we don't want, or at least I understand you to be saying, there's no dialectical resolution or a third way,
exactly.
right? It's not like we're gonna get sort of the third way out of like some conceptual Hegelian maneuver.
Yeah.
But so the tricks of the trade seem to be reworking without fetishizing decision, so without voluntarism. So understanding decision as bound to a rational, conceptual, constructive endeavor. And on the other hand, I suppose this is what I want to ask. The second part, the second Bowian definition, the repetition toward death. What is left of that in the end? Do you think that it's still, so does pop have something like a analogical inner mechanism that, like capital, just, as it were, is destined to self-catalyze itself until it crashes into the ground in some kind of apocalyptic final moment? You don't think so, I would presume, right?
Well, the reason I was mentioning this example is because, like, obviously, Bowie kept making music against that.
Right.
I mean, whatever you think of him or his career or his art or whatever, that was what his commitment was.
Right.
And he said, I was either going to give up music or invent this other world of music.
Right.
And like I say, taste aside, that was the mechanism that he was identifying. And I think it's fascinating that question, you could say that about any art form. You could say, as an artist, as a writer, as, a musician, living within the conditions of capital as we are, do we aspire to make culture that can be of another type, right? Yeah, it will be within the world of capital. We're in that's the given, if you like.
Right.
But is there a possibility to think from a different condition that isn't, that's why I kept saying can be taken seriously.
Right.
That isn't just an addition or an appendage to the current existing conditions, nor is it a weak hypothetical, right? And I think that the history of art has proven that it's been very desperate to think about these things seriously too. But my problem is that the way it's diagnosed the very conditions of both language are the sensible and representation have been incorrect. It hasn't like fully grasped like a comprehensive understanding of realism even for it to deal with these problems. And I don't know what, if it did that, what would happen in terms of capital, I don't know. But I do think it might even help us, even in a weird didactic sense, to rethink capital from that space of looking at those works,
right.
or understand it in a different way. And many people hate me saying that I should be didactic, but I don't mind. So occasionally. But what about the walking transit?
Oh yeah, place-based walks. So yeah, maybe I'm not sure exactly what the question was, but let's just give a little bit more definition on this. So yeah, one of the ways that is nice to explain this that Captrain uses is through like referring to Von Wexkull, who's this biologist who's very influenced by Kant. So he came up with this idea of the Umwelt. So animals' Umwelt is the environment as it appears to the animal through its cognitive sensory array, including like its organisation of the environment. So, for example, you've got the Umwelt of a mole, which includes its whole tunnel burrowing system and the way that it senses the world. Then you can have these kind of intra-umweltic variations where you'd be like, oh, so the mole decides to kind of tunnel down this way instead of that way, and it's changed its burrow, so it's altered its umwelt, its environment, right? And so it's altered the empirical possibilities within its environment. But it's still intra-umweltic and it's stayed in its same transcendental fixed position, right? But then you can also make transumweltic variations, which would be to alter the possibility of the empirical possibilities that you've got in that space, right? Yeah. And so, like, determining exactly which thing is going to constitute a transumweltic variation rather than just an intraumweltic one is a difficult thing. I think, because if we say, oh well, I think this argument is important that kind of those transumweltic variations are not going to be just restricted to making a logical, conceptual kind of argument, right? So it's not just in the space of like discourse that those things are going to change. But then also we don't want to just say, well, all of those, anything can be transumweltic variation, right? I think, for example, it would be very hard to conceive of a non-conceptual animal performing a transumweltic variation, because it would just not have the kind of inferential cognitive capacity to alter itself in that way, right? So I think it's and this is again why I kind of mentioned the myth of the given in talking about our perception, right? So it's because we are kind of conceptually concept-mongering creatures that we're able to then transform our cognitive capacities outside of language, right? So to use non-linguistic means to perform transumweltic variations. Yes.
Yeah. Can I start my question by saying that in a good way, I don't think your presentations were that different. No, because I mean, sorry that I arrived a bit late, so I heard only the end. So, but for the rest, I think, what seems interesting here is that, like you refer to freedom, like in my view, you refer to freedom in a way, like conceptual freedom in different ways, right? You have, Hannah, you were talking about, the self-positing aspect of this conceptual freedom. So the fact that you are able to self-posit your freedom to actually conceptualize possible worlds, let's say. And then Inigo, you were talking about the idea of that which is not, right? Which is the ability to like the freedom of conceptualization as it is triggered by counterfactuality to its own premises, right? And I think what was interesting in relation to that, in what you were saying, Amanda, is that I think precisely once we say that we might, have like conditions of possibilities for conceiving possible like other or possible worlds, right? But what we need then, and I think that's what you said somehow, if I understood well, is that this is only possible within a given historical context, right? In a way. So in other terms, I mean, even if you have the capacity of self-positing your freedom and the capacity of self-positing it in order to what it's not, to some extent, I guess it's also determined by the specific context in which you are, right? So to answer somehow the question maybe that was asked before, I think it's that, but you never have like fascism or communism, right? You have certain modes of governing that are fascist, certain modes of governing, and all that has to be constructed according to a given situation. And so I think then I'm wondering, so that's my question then, what do you make of this distinction that Nick Cernak, like to get a bit more political maybe, Nick Cernak and Alex Williams makes in the book about freedom from and freedom for, right? Because I think it's a crucial difference that we might not have conceived of enough yet, because we always tend to think about freedom as freedom from, so we want to liberate ourselves from given constraints, right? Which is in fact a very liberal formal conception of it, right? And what about then, freedom for, which is taking responsibility for your commitments to actually achieve something, which is probably where you can actually measure or attest for some transumveltic, procedure, I think, as the Russian Revolution, for instance, has failed to produce like the pure ideal of communism, but the way in which it achieved a certain reality of communism has totally changed what was possible to think about that in concrete terms, right? Which is probably as close as I can think to the transumveltic procedure. Okay.
Well, this raises an interesting question. Well, two things. One is that you're absolutely right that the question of the possible, what is possible, can only be answered in relationship to a set of contingent historical, let's say, empirical circumstances. But what's interesting about what Inigo was pointing out as well was that there's a set of transcendental conditions as well that are invariant. And I think it's important also to understand that even though part of what comes with rational cognition is the capacity to update ourselves, enhance our spaces of possibility, in other words, to rework the Umwelt itself, there are these, as it were, hard constraints to cognition, which define what any system would have to do in order to count as sapient or conceptual or whatever. So we can, as it were, distinguish three levels, right? Empirical constraints, which include historical constraints, soft transcendental constraints, which are liable to being updated or modified. For example, we invent through technological means ways to update our sensory apparatuses. We already can do that. And then we have the hard conceptual constraints that tell us what invariably has to obtain in order for, say, cognition to obtain. So that's one thing. The other thing is about, I think there's something that I want to maybe ask Anna to elaborate on this, about the thetic conception of freedom. Because it seems like the thetic conception of freedom is, as you said, defined in fact by its eradication of all content. As soon as it becomes determinate, it relapses into non-freedom. And I think that correct me if I'm wrong, the conceptual origins of this idea goes to Kant's idea of being not being a real predicate, right? If you say there is a chair, a possible chair or an actual chair, to say that there is a chair doesn't act any new determinations. It's the same chair. The concept of chair hasn't changed. So the idea with Fichte is that there are these static judgments that are not cognitive in the sense that they don't give us knowledge, right? Because precisely they don't have any determinations. There's no predication that you can give about the I, the pure I, the pure ego. But then my question is, okay, so if any kind of determination, and this probably goes back to what Arne was saying, if any kind of determination is immediately a violation of the nature of freedom, then it seems like it's basically a negative conception in which all you can say is freedom is not that which has any determinate characterizations, right? And I'm wondering if that is too weak, right? To think about a concrete sort of possibility for action or construction or something. Isn't this just like an empty notion of freedom? Is this kind of almost Sartrean void of action just losses itself? But I don't know.
Yeah, so then freedom is a metaphysical notion.
Yeah.
In the sense that we cannot have knowledge of freedom.
Right.
We can postulate freedom, but we cannot know it. And so the idea of aesthetic judgment is actually coming from Kant, but it's not coming, it's not coming from Kant in the sense that it's a judgment that is not adding any determination to the object, but it's a judgment which is part of the transcendental logic. So the idea is that in formal logic, you can suppose some principle, like for example, the principle of identity, etc. But the positing of A equal to A doesn't entail the existence of A. So in order to think of a production of possible world, you have to posit the possibility of existence of something, not just the formal side, the conceptual side. So the aesthetic judgment is a judgment which think of a possibility of existence of a determined reality.
Right. So
object in general. So A is not equal to A because a real object is never equal to itself. It's always an infinitesimal difference because you are considering it twice in order to verify the identity.
Right.
So actually, freedom is the zero degree of possibility of existence.
I see. No, that's much.
So in the sense of degrees rather than like a differential.
Right. It's as it were the ground. That's the interesting thing because it's the ground floor of the system, and precisely Fichte introduces the aesthetic judgment of the self-postulating ego to compensate for what was perceived to be a deficiency in Kant's transcendental logic.
Yeah, and then it comes, if you want, it comes from Leibniz. Because Leibniz you have two sides. You have the sides of, okay, I am a subject and I'm trying to know reality.
Mm-hmm.
But on the other side, you have the way in which reality is produced by God calculus.
Yeah.
And God calculus is a differential calculus. So perception is integrating. And is integrating this infinitesimal difference. And you will never get the concept in itself because
it's just like conventional.
Yeah. So that was the idea.
Oh, sure. No, can I go first? Because I'll be really quick. I'll be super quick. Not to say that you won't, but we can.
I'll be
I was just going to say, Diane and Anna, I wonder if that's a question of grammar, like a kind of a limit of grammar. Like freedom in this Fichtean sense, in the thetic sense, can't have objectives that can be realized in the sense that you're describing. They self-negate, but instead is freedom then just a verb, and that could be very positive. It's freedom of verb instead. It's not an object to be achieved, which I think reconditions Anna's problem that he's describing about how to determine one kind of world as good and one kind of world as bad. Freedom is not the guarantee, as you were describing that, freedom is not the guarantee of an ethical or moral determination as an objective. It's merely a procedural action.
It's a direction for thought. So freedom in itself is a metaphysical object like God. It's not something. I cannot know freedom. It's not an object.
Yeah.
It's the conditions of possibility of producing object at least.
Yeah.
So So you can have an idea of what would you produce if you could be completely free of determining the world you would like to live in. And you can strive to get it.
Yeah, because you're using the word strive, which is.
It's orientation for, I think it's more orientation for activity rather than.
Right, yes, yeah. Thank you.
Well, I have this seminar, it's called Parallel Worlds. So the students have been struggling with what the possible world formula might look like. And I'll just basically summarize what they discovered. The examples run from maybe the 1880s forward, the usual suspects from science fiction to urban history to many of the ones that you mentioned, but more historical, let's say, I think. And they seem to have a sense, so I'll ask for your comments as if they were here, right? And I'll be quick. It's hard to do sometimes, to summarize what 20 people think, but we'll say, I'm not gonna do it well, but I'll do it this way. Anyway, so they first begin by saying any notion of the possible in this parallel world sense is deeply a-centered at this point, so we actually can't find them in the same way that we did before. I wouldn't tell you all the examples that came, that's a waste of our precious time, but you get the point how they might arrive at that. Then they almost all their projects and ideas are built around, at this point, and I like it, you know, that no matter what the world is on either side, let's say we're in duality, common world and yours or possible, that they're both parasites. In the double sense of parasite. A parasite like a flora in the stomach that helps you digest, or a parasite that eats your stomach. and you're not quite aware of which part you are. They like the Philip K. Dick versions, and you know, you can imagine how science fiction, a folk in Beijing, you know, all these kinds of Chinese science fiction versions. And interesting, right? I know it's slightly off where the conversation's been, but I cannot but feel I should speak for them, right? It's an interesting problem, and see if that generates some commentary, right? Does that make sense?
Well, I don't really know how to talk about this.
I know it's a bit of a jump, but I thought it might open up some.
Yeah, no, I think it does in an interesting way. I mean, I'm not going to talk about the parallel world problem because it's beyond me, I think, at the moment. But I did want to bring up, I mean, because it brings up questions about like physical determinacy versus kind of other forms. Right?
Yes, and that's
so, I mean, one thing that's interesting with this, say, I mean, for example, you know, in physics, so what you've got there with you know, you can map the nonlinear trajectories of dynamic systems by constructing a phase space, which gives you all of the possibilities that the system could be in, right? Yes. So it gives you the whole possibility space of, say, a planet as it's orbiting, right? And then because you can map out all of the possibilities, then you can calculate the probability that it's going to actualize in one of these possibilities, right? Okay. And in some sense, you know, Leibniz's whole project is based on this kind of hypothesis, right? But then I think, you know, we need to distinguish between different levels of analysis, and I think they have different epistemic modalities, right? So if you're looking at the trajectories of biological systems, you can't construct a phase space for them because we cannot map all of the possibilities that an animal will actualize, right? Not in the same way as you can with a planet or a bullet or whatever. Right? So, and because, you know, an action that the animal makes may alter the space based entirely. So and you know this there's this I forget the name of this guy now, but there's a biologist who came up with this idea of the adjacent space. Mm-hmm. So like if you think of like a whole mapped out phase space, and then there's, you know, so this is the whole possibilities, and then there's this adjacent space which was just previously not available, but which is opened up by an action within this space. Okay. So what happens continuously with living systems, the trajectories of living systems, is this unfolding of adjacent spaces. which you can think of symmetry breaking transformations on the phase space. So like the idea then is just to think about the ways in which like complex systems will require different epistemic modalities for the tracking of their possibilities and the actualization.
It's almost like a membrane that's constantly changing, but you never pass through it. It just keeps changing.
Right.
You're kind of stuck there watching the membrane.
Yeah.
Whether you ever get through it, anything's going to happen.
Exactly. It's a cascade of symmetry breaking transitions, and all we can do is surface.
That's true. They would like that. They would like that.
Yeah, I wanted to kind of draw a conceptual differentiation between things that came up from your presentations. One is modality or possibility, and the other is probability. And modality, even in its kind of earlier version, is a theological kind of medieval conception of utopia. Whereas probability, even before Hume, started from empiricism, Bacon, and so on, and it's actually more related to the problem of induction. But I think there is a slight semantic confusion when we talk about model probabilities in complex systems because they entirely have different kind of meaning. But I think what is interesting also in terms of Armin's question is whether we are capable of generating utopian political image, and also Amanda's question, or we're locked into this sort of dance of probabilistic politics that is bound to be controlled by either fascism or capitalism. So it's a kind of a musing and a question, whether there is a third way of, because between the possible and the probable, or they're like incommensurable by definition.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to make that distinction. Yeah, and I agree completely with this. I guess for me that if we think like this probabilistic framework, I mean, I guess I was kind of pointing to that with this, which so the probability theory and what came from it, which I think is you can attach to statistical analysis as well as AI and so on, and then there's which I think is tied to this kind of to this rejection of causal model. And so, I think when you bring properly causal modeling back into that, then it's no longer kind of, you're no longer in this world of like pure facts where you're just going to probabilistically be in this place or that place, right? But you're in a world which you've causally intervened on, and where you're modeling how your intervention you're counterfactually modeling your interventional possibilities, and that's I think allows for the possibility of thinking outside of that probability landscape, right? But then not necessarily so, right? It's a matter of like having the politics to do that, I guess.
And just to say very briefly that I kind of rushed the last part because I wrote too much, and even though I made everyone do 10 minutes, I wrote too much of my own, and so I was a bit rushing over the random stuff. But I used that random stuff to try and somehow address that problem and to try and say, well, I do think that the way in which the random is suspicious of some elements of modal vocabularies, and yet, of course, in this investing in them is very interesting to me, because the problem he outlines as being that question of in this kind of non-empiricist inferential kind of, so the area of inferential commitments in a non-empiricist based kind of like projection, what how are we thinking of grounds? Like, what are the conditions to, let's say, think reality without reference in that position? And I think that what is demanded then is a kind of readdress of deontic modality, and to say that this is not a theism, this is not like a blind faith or a kind of just a whatever kind of like production, like the production of anything, the way in which art has kind of proliferated itself in the kind of principle of the whatever, if you like, but more in the sense of how can an analytics, a rational kind of approach to thinking the grounds of our commitments help us to have, like, I guess I'm trying to say this without using moralistic, like, or political language, because it's really easy for me to kind of slip into that. But maybe a correct means or mechanism of producing modal vocabularies that are responsible and answerable to deontic modal commitments. So it's not just a house of cards, right? That's what I'm trying to say. Like, that there actually is a kind of means at which one can establish this, like, let's call it a self-legitimizing system, but it actually has reason built through it. It's not just anything. And I just think that in the world of art, it's kind of self-legitimating practice has been so habituated and taken as given itself that it just invents the political in an arbitrary sense, like in the sense that everything's political, right? Which is still claimed by many artists and artworks, which is false to me. So I'm wishing a bit, but anyway, I'm trying to describe that.
Is there questions on here?
There's questions.
Oh,
Hello?
yeah, Joshua.
Joshua.
I'm just on a giant screen right now, or at least okay. It flickers in and out. Can you hear me well, or am I breaking up?
Perfect.
Okay, fantastic. No, I mean, I noticed there were a number of things throughout that. I mean, I guess to your point, maybe I kind of wanted to talk a bit between, I guess, maybe some of Dan and Inigo's original points. I mean, I guess one of the things about something also that Adam brought up, I guess, too, the distinction between sort of like the possibility provided by modal logic and the possibilities of statistical sort of reasoning, and that kind of distinction that's happening there. I mean, because modal logic is a particular sort of like axiomatic system. I mean, it has sort of ground rules for how it is realized. Kripkean logic can obviously be modified by adding certain sort of like axiomatic rules. It's not self-reflexive, for instance, like automatically. So you can create another sort of like variation of Kripkean logic by adding new sort of like axiomatic sets to it. And then I think some of the things that Dan was pointing to towards the end, I think he referenced Puntel and I forget who else, but he also talked about Zalamea and Brassier's sort of more late advances on modal logic. But I was also, I guess, wondering about Awadi and like Kishida's sort of categorical investigations of modal logic, and the sort of notion of thinking about modal space as a kind of more general sort of categorical space, one that provides certain sort of inductive conditions. So that kind of operation of coming up with a sort of general problem space that allows for sort of unique particular realizations within a certain sort of formalized or rational logic of Kripkean space is a really interesting sort of well, possibility, I guess. And I kind of wanted to like put that on top of Inigo's points about the sort of evolution of language and the sort of evolution of indexical sounds to more complex sort of formalistic linguistic organization. And then finally, his latter point of, I guess, how animals, as they operate within a space, sort of break the symmetry of that space to come up with new sorts of ways of realizing that space. So once you have moved from a sort of indexical mode of gathering reality to a sort of more complex formal linguistic organization of reality such that you can build something like K-space or Kripkean space, you open up a kind of new possibility for realizing the sort of formal conditions of how you understand your reality. And if you can sort of build this into a really abstract, generalized overview of procedures, from there you can kind of, I guess, look at what the possibilities that you may not have thought of are available in your space, come up with a sort of abstract model of the overall thing. And then you can drill down to what are maybe sort of actualizing possibilities within that model. So you may wind up opening up these sort of adjacent symmetry breaking spaces through this sort of purely abstract formalization.
So first about the role of category theory, for example, in topology, and this kind of history of modal logic and formal logic more generally. So toward the end, I was trying to distinguish two, as it were, historical vectors that sprawl after the quote-unquote modal semantic paradigm inaugurated by Kripke, but which, as you well put, can be modulated to sort of play around with the basic principles and axioms of the semantic meta-language, right? So, for example, one of the two, so the two directions or vectors are, on the one hand, what I call like the syntactical approach, quote unquote, which tries to decant the mathematical investigation of structure from any kind of residual dependency on natural language. So, for example, Girard does that, right? He completely, his investigation of Lukács is basically campaigning for syntax without semantics. So semantics goes out the window. Now, the problem with that is that, and it's, by the way, he recognizes category theory as another vector that can be understood in this direction, even though, of course, topology can be understood also semantically. But the problem with this direction is that then you get the question of how you correlate this mathematical understanding of either structure or categorical specificity to possibilities or in the sort of, not just vernacular, but to other domains. It seems like the moment you amputate the sort of semantic task to correlate descriptive languages, which are, let's face it, non-formal by and large, like our model operators are not, by default, intelligible without dependency on, for example, epistemic concepts and deontic concepts and so on. So then the question becomes, well, okay, you're in this pure mathematical universe and this Platonist waters, and then the question of how this relates to anything else outside of it, including art, politics, whatever you want, becomes really obscure. And here is where people like Badiou come in, right, and say, okay, you can understand something like a Heyting algebra with, very basic and simple constraints as basically giving you a phenomenology of worlds. And the way he does this is just by drawing analogies, right? So he'll look at an axiom or formula or theorem within the algebra, and he'll talk to you about paintings and foliages in the wall and how much the foliage is green or whatever. And what I was trying to say is that is the other problem, right? We have on the one hand the problem of insulating the mathematical from the descriptive, and on the other hand we have the problem of filling the gap with these kind of analogical descriptions, which are, I think, not robust enough and arbitrary in a certain sense. So it kind of mirrors the question that Amanda was raising, where on the one hand we want to divorce the notion of construction from facile voluntaristic notions of decision, creation, you name it. But at the same time, we can't just simply, constrain it to a narrow formal conception such that its correlation to the world and to all other domains of practice becomes arbitrary, a matter of descriptive caprice, as it were. So I think that's where, I don't know if that helps at all.
No, I think that's fair. I mean, I guess I was kind of trying to, I think between that and maybe sort of Inigo's description of the sort of development of the kind of transcendental conditions, upon which we can realize these particular faculties of abstract realization or formalization. I mean, it shows that there is some sort of, I guess, hyper-prior tying of our sort of understanding of how past conditions have obtained materialistically and causally in the world to how we realize certain sort of abstract formal conditions or build formal systems such that we can get something like K-logic. And then the elaboration of K-logic as a sort of completely generic space through a sort of categorical theoretic operation allows us to sort of determine what the limits of that are, but also within those limits, certain very particular realization conditions within that possibility of that kind of transcendental condition. And expressing those or understanding what the possible limits of that expression are may bleed over into leading into these new sort of asymmetric spaces that break our current bounds of our understanding of our transcendental condition and, open up a new sort of possible phase space for new freedoms.
Okay, we probably have about time for one more. Andrew?
Great, thanks. Yeah, so I had a question about one maybe unique characteristic of language and possible worlds, which is the ability to talk about the false and false statements and false expressions. And in particular, at one moment we might think of it as just like a bug. But I think especially in more recent times, it seems to be actually a feature in the sense that, a world of fake news, or if we go to older models such as Deleuze talking about cinema as the power of the false and its ability to create new worlds through falsity. I'm wondering, how do we account for the ability for, the false to often be far more powerful than the truth, and that it really creates new realities through false statements?
Well, I'll just say briefly about this quickly. One of the things you could, in this demarcation question between like animal communication systems and human language proper, you can say, and this is an argument, for example, so between like left Slavians and right Slavians. So you get someone like Millikan who says like the waggle dance of the bee has truth conditions that are intrinsic to it. So when a bee says, nectar is over there at this distance and this quality, then it's either right or wrong. So it can be false information. But I think Rescoe does a good argument. Has a good argument against the needing truth conditions to explain the properties of that animal communication system. So basically, we can understand the whole of that operation in engineering terms or information theoretic terms. And effectively, if you don't need to use truth conditions to explain something, then you shouldn't. So, but whereas you do need truth conditions to explain kind of intentionality proper. If I take that as a table, then and it turns out to be something else, then I'm false, right? And so falsity and truth occur both at the same, come out of intentionality proper and the logical form of inference. And clearly, in some sense, like falsity, I agree, is like way more important in the sense that counterfactual reasoning was crucial for that whole development, right? The capacity to say, if if I didn't do this, then what would happen? You know, if this were to be the case, then what would be the case? You know, that's what is like really the bootstrapping capacity of logical thought.
So it's interesting because at least in the semantic modal conception that I described briefly, truth is understood relative to this concept of a possible world, which is in turn understood structurally in terms of set theory, right? So there is a correlation between the true and the constructible in this sense. What is true is the possibility of coordinating statements in a modal language to a constructible set theoretical structure, right? So then what is the false? Well, it is something, it's a claim which blatantly is either, you can define it as either what is not constructible, there is no model for the claim, there is no model that verifies the actual modal vocabulary in question, or it is something that explicitly contradicts every available model for the claim or set of claims, right? So what's the effect of this? I think the interesting, more, let's say, lesson to be drawn from this aspect of constructibility or relationship between truth and constructibility is that what truth is in this sort of structural sense has to be relative to testability. You can test your concepts and your statements by building a structure that, as it were, verifies the theoretical claims or the vocabulary that you have. If you don't have that protocol of testability, of testing, then you're flapping in the void, right? Now, if you want to say, well, how to explain that flapping in the void can have such effects in the world, right? It's because it's easier, right? Yeah. I mean, construction is this kind of like, okay, I get it, and I agree that the semantic conception that constrains construction to what can be explained in the vocabulary of set theory, and thus the possible to the vocabulary of set theory, is too restrictive. But still, the notion of constructibility, to me, seems to be worth preserving, so that the fact that falsity can have extraordinary effects, or that what is not testable can have extraordinary effects, is a symptom of cognitive weakness, but not just cognitive weakness, right? Also of deliberate desire to manipulate or whatever you want, right?
And I think it's really interesting because it, just like I was saying, that the problem is the problem is the House of Cards model, which is kind of what you're describing, which is worlds are built on falsities and sustain themselves very well in the world. And I think that one of the, besides or as well as cognitive weakness, which I totally agree with, is this back to maybe these things that maybe Indigo was talking about before a little bit, I think, was this fear of cause, this fear of cause, but the lack of this like legitimization of being disinterested in thinking about cause. So what I was trying to do in my paper a little bit was kind of explain why maybe movements in art is being so keen to legitimize the rejection of causal thinking, and I could see why, because it's a kind of question of critiquing colonialism. It's a question of like critiquing the kind of instrumentalization of reason and so on that we associate with like bad forms of dominance. But I just, as I've said, you know, what has resulted from that is this love affair with the indeterminacy of history, the idea that anything can happen anytime, and this liberal kind of pleasure in being distracted in the present with it could have been otherwise, everything could have been something else, rather than actually dealing with, well, something did lead to this condition, and we can think about that. That is thinkable. Now, that doesn't, I'm not saying that is, like I say, a fatalistic narrative where we're determined by everything other than ourselves. It's not like opposing one to the other, but it's not kind of over-determining this idea of what could be or what is possible with this kind of like, so let's say, neoliberal, liberal fear of thinking that that something did cause this situation to happen. And I think the fake news and all that is, of course, part of that rejection. Of course, it can just invent itself, therefore, and be completely welcomed, and we will all like indulge in it as if it's something, as if it kind of is legitimate. And I think to weed out and make those distinctions and to take sides around that is crucial. And so I think that's what allows us to kind of enter into the landscape and like dissect it. I don't know if you want to say something about fake and false worlds.
Yeah, so I mean, from a perspective that I outlined before, so the perspective of a transcendental logic, which is concerned with the possibility of existence of objects rather than with formal condition of description of objects. What is fake is a fiction. So it can be formally current, but it cannot, it's not determined as a real object.
Can I say one brief thing, because it just occurred to me before wrapping up, just like, I think to the extent that we speak, I mean, we're all sort of here talking in sort of post-Kantian key, and one of the sort of metaphors, I don't know if you can call it metaphor, but this whole idea of reason as being a kind of game that one plays, the game of giving and asking for reasons, right? So a way to think about the possible effects of falsity is to think about cheating, the concept of cheating. What does it mean to cheat in a game? So of course, any claim, any debate that you might be having comes under certain constraints of conceptual intelligibility, concerning what you're talking about, standards of justification. These are socially determined, but yeah, that's what they are. But of course, any game can be made much, in any game of giving and asking for reasons, in any argument, you can cheat, right? You can avoid abiding to those constraints and throw ad hominems, say, irrelevant stuff, contradict yourself. For what? For the purposes of having the desired effect. Trigger somebody to believe something you want, trigger an emotional response, whatever, right? And I think this is an interesting way to think about this question, about the powers of the false, which is not only to think about the way in a sort of like vernacular sense, the distortion of truth, but in terms of a procedural logic of cheating and abiding to rules. How is it that a particular violation of a norm or a rule, which is conceptual within the space of reasons, enables a particular effect to be obtained, a shortcut, even if this means that you're no longer, strictly speaking, playing the game, right? Because if you're not playing by the rules, you're not playing the game, right? So I don't know if it's an invitation.
Okay, I'd add just two quick things. One, I think Possible Worlds might be by Stuart Hall, Possible Without Guarantee. And as you know, at the end of the third season of Man in the High Castle, the American Reich is in the Poconos in a coal mine trying to break into other worlds, but there is a resistance, okay? So I think I'm betting on the resistance from season 4. Having said that, I'd like to thank all of our panelists. Please give them
That's not another.
Really?